The courtroom smelled like floor cleaner and stale coffee. I remember that detail more than anything else from that morning. The way the fluorescent lights buzzed slightly overhead, the way my hands were cold even though it was June, the way my ex-husband Daniel sat across the table with his arms crossed and a smirk on his face like he'd already won. His attorney, a man named Garrett Walsh who wore cufflinks to a family court hearing, leaned back in his chair and tapped his pen against a legal pad. He looked bored, genuinely bored. Like this was the easiest case he'd handled all month. Maybe it was. From the outside I imagine it looked that way. I was 51 years old. I drove a 2019 Honda CR-V with a cracked windshield I kept meaning to fix. I wore a gray blazer I'd bought on clearance from Macy's 3 years ago. My attorney, a woman named Carol Simmons, who I trusted completely and who charged me less than she should have, sat beside me with a yellow notepad and sensible shoes. Daniel had told the children I'd been a glorified lab tech. That's the phrase he used, not just during the divorce proceedings. He'd apparently been saying it for years. To our son, to our daughter, at dinner parties, to his mother on the phone. Your mother was a glorified lab tech. Don't let her make it sound like more than it was. I knew this because our daughter, Megan, had repeated it back to me 6 months earlier. Not to be cruel, but because she was 24 and confused and trying to reconcile the version of me she'd grown up with and the version her father had been quietly constructing in the background for decades. Is it true? She'd asked me. We were sitting in her apartment in Columbus, Ohio, eating takeout Thai food, and she looked genuinely uncertain. Dad says you were basically a secretary for doctors, that you exaggerated what you did when you talked to us growing up. I set down my fork. I looked at her for a long moment. No, I said. It's not true. She nodded slowly like she was filing that away. She didn't ask me to explain further, and I didn't. That was a habit I'd developed over 30 years that I was only beginning to understand was a problem. I grew up in Dayton, Ohio, in a small house on a street full of small houses, the kind of neighborhood where everyone knew your business and nobody locked their doors. My father worked at a GM plant for 31 years. My mother was a school librarian. We were not a dramatic family. We were not a family that talked about feelings at the dinner table. We were a family that fixed things quietly and moved on. I think that's where it started. My habit of not explaining myself, of letting the work speak, and assuming that was enough. I enrolled at Ohio State in 1991 on an academic scholarship. Pre-med. My advisor told me during my sophomore year that I had one of the strongest records in my cohort, and I remember feeling pleased for exactly 45 seconds before worrying about my biochemistry exam the following Thursday. I was not someone who lingered in compliments. I just moved on to the next thing. I graduated in 1995 and I went straight into the United States Army. Not because I had to, because I wanted to. My uncle had served in Vietnam and come back quietly changed, and there was something in his stories. Not the horror, but the sense of purpose, the sense of doing something that genuinely mattered, that had lodged itself in me when I was 9 years old and never quite left. I was commissioned as a Medical Service Corps officer. I did my officer basic course at Fort Sam Houston in San Antonio that summer, in Texas heat that was nothing like Ohio heat, the kind that presses down on you from every direction at once. I loved it. I know that sounds strange, but I loved the structure, the clarity of purpose, the sense that every person around me was operating at full capacity toward something real. My first duty station was Fort Bragg, North Carolina. I was 23 years old, responsible for coordinating medical logistics for a unit of several hundred soldiers, managing supply chains for equipment I had to learn entirely from scratch. My commanding officer was a man named Colonel Richard Hathaway, who had the patience of a saint and the expectations of someone who believed you should meet them or explain why not. He taught me more in 18 months than I'd learned in 4 years of college. I spent 9 years in the Army. Fort Bragg. A rotation to South Korea. A deployment to Bosnia in the late 90s during the peacekeeping operations, where I coordinated medical support for a forward operating base, and watched doctors and nurses work in conditions that would have broken most people, and watched them do it without complaint. I was promoted twice. I received a Meritorious Service Medal, and an Army Commendation Medal, and several other commendations that I kept in a box in my closet when I got out, because I didn't know what else to do with them. I separated from the Army in 2004. I was 33 years old. I wanted to start a family. I had met Daniel 18 months earlier at a friend's wedding in Cincinnati, and he had seemed, at the time, like exactly the kind of stable, grounded person I was looking for, after nearly a decade of instability that I had loved but was ready to step back from. Daniel was an accountant. He coached his nephew's Little League team on Saturdays. He drove a sensible car and had opinions about lawn care and remembered people's birthdays. He was comfortable in a way I found deeply appealing after years of nothing being comfortable. What I didn't understand then, and what took me a long time to understand later, was that Daniel's comfort came from control. He needed to be the most competent person in the room. And when he realized he wasn't, when the reality of who I was and what I'd done became inconvenient to his sense of how our household hierarchy worked, he did adjust his understanding. He adjusted the story. It happened gradually, the way most erosion does. Not a flood, but water on stone, wearing it down so slowly, you don't notice the shape changing until one day you run your hand over it, and the surface is completely different than you remembered. The first time he called what I'd done administrative work was at a dinner party in 2009. Someone had asked about my background and I'd mentioned my army service, and he jumped in smoothly, almost protectively, and said she handled the administrative side of things. You know, the paperwork that keeps the whole machine running. And he smiled and changed the subject, and I sat there holding my wine glass trying to figure out if I should correct him in front of his colleagues. I didn't. I'm still not entirely sure why. Part of it was not wanting to cause a scene. Part of it was the habit I'd already developed of letting things go. Part of it was that I genuinely didn't know, at that point, how much it would matter. By 2015, the version of me that Daniel had constructed for his social circle was so thoroughly established that I sometimes caught myself wondering if he'd actually convinced himself. Our son, Tyler, he was 17 then, and at that age where he processed everything through whatever lens was easiest, had started saying things at the dinner table that he'd clearly absorbed from his father. Mom's job wasn't really front-line stuff, he said once, matter-of-factly, when a topic came up about the military. She was more behind the scenes. I looked at him. Where did you hear that? I asked. He shrugged. Dad said. I should have corrected it then. Clearly, firmly, with documentation if necessary. But I'd spent years by that point smoothing things over, and starting an argument at the dinner table about my own credentials seemed, I don't know, undignified. I thought the truth would surface eventually on its own. It didn't. That's not how truth works. Truth doesn't surface. Truth gets buried unless someone digs. The divorce process started in the spring of 2 years ago. I won't go into everything that led there. That's a longer story, and most of it is ordinary and painful in the way most marriage endings are ordinary and painful. There was no single catastrophic event. There was a long accumulation of small things, a growing silence between us that stopped feeling peaceful and started feeling like walls. And then one morning I woke up and understood, with perfect clarity, that I had been living in someone else's version of my life for a very long time. Daniel hired Garrett Walsh within a week. I found out through Megan, who'd heard from Tyler, who'd heard from Daniel directly. Walsh had a reputation for aggressive asset negotiations. He was expensive and strategic, and the message being sent was unambiguous. I hired Carol Simmons, who had a small practice downtown, and who came recommended by a woman I'd met through a community group. Carol was methodical. She was not flashy. She asked very detailed, specific questions and wrote everything down in small, neat handwriting, and when I finished explaining my background to her during our first meeting, she set down her pen and said, "We're going to need documentation." "I have it," I said. "All of it?" "All of it." The primary dispute was financial. Daniel had spent the last decade building a narrative. Partially with his attorney, partially in conversations with people who might be called as character references, that positioned me as someone who had spent our marriage as a part-time medical administrator while he'd built his career. The implication being that the financial assets accumulated during our marriage were primarily the result of his contributions. The problem with this narrative was that it was not even close to accurate. After leaving the Army, I had gone back to school. I had completed a master's in healthcare administration. I had joined a mid-sized regional hospital group in 2007 as a department manager, had been promoted to director of clinical operations in 2012, and had, by the time the divorce proceedings began, spent 15 years building systems and supervising staff and managing budgets that were, and I want to be precise here, significantly larger than Daniel's. None of this was secret. None of it was hidden. It was all documentable, all verifiable, all entirely real. But Daniel had spent so many years referring to my work dismissively, so many years flattening what I did into something smaller and more manageable for his own comfort, that I think he'd genuinely forgotten that the documents would say something different. Or maybe he just assumed I wouldn't push back. That was, historically, a reasonable assumption. The morning of the asset hearing, I wore the gray blazer. I thought about wearing something else, something that might read as more authoritative, and then I thought about how much I disliked making decisions based on how other people were going to read me, and I put on the gray blazer. I drove myself. I got there early. I sat in the parking lot for 12 minutes and listened to the end of a radio program about migratory birds and thought about absolutely nothing in particular. Inside, the courtroom was smaller than I'd expected. Family court always is, somehow. You picture grand marble columns and a judge elevated above everyone on a raised platform, and instead you get drop ceilings and chairs that look like they came from an office supply liquidation sale. Daniel was already there when I walked in. He was talking to Walsh in a low voice, and when he saw me he stopped talking and smiled. Not warmly, the smile that meant he thought he had something. I sat down next to Carol. She opened her folder. I folded my hands on the table in front of me. Walsh opened his remarks by establishing a financial history that was, technically, not false, but was framed in a way that made me sound like a pleasant secondary earner who had taken extended leave several times over the course of our marriage. He mentioned my Army years in a single sentence and described my current role in terms that were accurate in title and completely wrong in scope. The judge, a woman named the Honorable Patricia Marsh, who I had heard was methodical and fair, listened and made small notes. Daniel, when he had a chance to speak, was measured and reasonable in that particular way of his, the way that had seemed like composure when I first met him and that I now understood was performance. He talked about his career progression. He talked about the years he had been the primary earner. He said the phrase, the nature of her contributions, in a way that made the air quotes audible even though he didn't actually make them. Walsh glanced at me once during Daniel's summary, briefly. The assessment kind of glance. I looked back at him with no particular expression. Then Carol stood up. She began with my military record. She had a copy of my DD-214, the military separation document that every veteran has, the one that lists every duty station, every commendation, every duty title. She read from it clearly and without drama. Meritorious Service Medal, Army Commendation Medal. She named the positions I had held, the size of the units I had supported, the nature of the work. Across the room, Daniel's expression shifted. Just slightly. Something moved behind his eyes. Walsh leaned forward and wrote something on his legal pad. Carol then moved to my civilian career. She had pulled employment records, salary history, performance evaluations, letters of commendation from hospital administration, documentation of specific budget responsibilities. She laid out a 15-year career trajectory that was, objectively, significant by any measure. She paused at one point, shuffled a single page to the top of her stack, and looked at Judge Marsh. Your Honor, she said, I'd like to submit Exhibit 14 for the record. She slid a copy across to Walsh and placed the original in front of the judge. I had not seen Exhibit 14 until Carol showed it to me 3 days earlier. I had forgotten it existed, honestly. It was a letter of commendation from the Regional Hospital Systems Board of Directors, issued in 2019, recognizing my department's outcomes and citing specific metrics, cost savings, patient outcome improvements, staff retention numbers, that represented, as the letter phrased it, exceptional institutional value. Walsh looked at the page. He read it once. Then he picked it up and read it again. I watched his face. He set the page down. He turned to Daniel and said something very quietly. Daniel's jaw tightened. Judge Marsh read the letter without any visible reaction, which I found either reassuring or terrifying depending on the second. Walsh asked for a brief recess. Carol said, "Of course." We stood in the hallway for 11 minutes. Carol bought a cup of coffee from the vending machine down the hall and said nothing, which I appreciated. A court officer walked by. A woman in a yellow cardigan was talking on her phone near the water fountain. Outside the tall windows at the end of the corridor, I could see a slice of parking lot and a line of trees just starting to go fully green with early summer. I thought about my father, who had worked 31 years at a GM plant without anyone asking him to justify the value of what he contributed. I thought about my commanding officer at Fort Bragg, Colonel Hathaway, who used to say that the most important thing you could do was know the standard and meet it, and that anyone who didn't understand what you'd done would eventually be confronted with the record. I thought about Megan in her Columbus apartment, holding her container of pad thai, asking me with genuinely confused eyes if I'd exaggerated my own life. I didn't feel angry standing in that hallway. That's what I remember most. Not anger. Something quieter and more durable. The sense of something that had been crooked for a long time finally being adjusted to level. When we went back in, Walsh did not look bored anymore. The hearing concluded that afternoon. Judge Marsh took the case under advisement, which means she didn't rule immediately. She took a few days to review everything submitted. I had known this would likely happen and had steeled myself for the wait. Carol called me on a Thursday morning, 8 days later. I was at work, between meetings, standing in the hallway outside a conference room with my phone to my ear. "It went our way," she said. She walked me through the particulars. The asset division came out significantly more equitably than what Daniel and Walsh had originally been proposing. Judge Marsh cited, among several factors, the documentation of my professional contributions over the duration of the marriage, and specifically noted the disparity between the characterization offered in the initial filing and the record as established. I thanked Carol. I asked her to send me the written decision when it was available. I went back into my meeting. I didn't cry. I didn't call anyone right away. I sat in the meeting and listened to a presentation about Q3 operational projections, and somewhere underneath that I felt the specific, quiet satisfaction of a thing being set right. I told Megan about the outcome that weekend. We had dinner at a Mexican place near her apartment that she'd been wanting to try. We ordered guacamole and she had a margarita, and I had iced tea, and when the food came, I told her what had happened. She listened. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Why didn't you ever say more about what you actually did?" she asked. "Like growing up, why didn't you push back when Dad said things?" It was a fair question. I'd thought about it a lot. "I thought the work spoke for itself," I said. "I was wrong about that." She nodded. She reached across the table and put her hand over mine for a second, and then she picked up her fork and started eating, because she is my daughter, and we are not a family that dwells in moments longer than they require. But I saw something in her face that I hadn't seen during the conversation in her apartment 6 months earlier. Not confusion. Something more like recalibration. The quiet process of replacing a wrong story with a true one. My son Tyler called me the following Tuesday. He was 26, living in Denver, and he rarely called without a reason. We talked about his job for a while. We talked about whether he was going to come back for Thanksgiving, and then he said, carefully, "Megan told me about the court thing." "Okay," I said. "She told me about what she found out. What you actually did in the army. Your job at the hospital." "Okay," I said again. There was a long pause. "I feel like I didn't know that stuff," he said. "About you. I feel like I should have known it." I thought about saying you would have, if your father hadn't spent years constructing a different version. But that wasn't a conversation I wanted to have, and it wouldn't have helped anything. And Tyler was 26 years old, and learning to think for himself, and he didn't need me to hand him conclusions. "Now you know," I said. He called again the following Sunday. Just to talk. "There's something I've been thinking about since all of this ended. I spent 30 years in 2 institutions. The Army and civilian healthcare, where the documentation of your performance was taken seriously and preserved carefully, where there was a paper trail for what you'd actually done, a record that existed independent of anyone's opinion of you. And somehow, in the institution of my own marriage, in my own household, with the people I was closest to, I had let the documentation lapse. I had assumed that being present and working hard and being clearly, observably competent was enough. That the people who mattered would simply see. They don't always see. People see what they're shown, and when someone close to you is quietly, consistently showing them something different, they adjust their picture to match what they're given. I should have pushed back earlier, clearly, calmly, with evidence if necessary. Not to win an argument, but because the truth has a right to be spoken even when no one is challenging it. Especially then. I have a colleague at work, a woman about 15 years younger than me, who recently started undervaluing her own contributions in meetings. Minimizing, softening, adding qualifiers to things that don't need qualifiers. I've started gently pushing back when I see it, not loudly, just a hand on her shoulder afterward, a quiet word. You don't have to make it smaller to make it palatable. Say the thing plainly. She looked surprised the first time I said it. Then she smiled. I keep the DD-214 in a proper file now, not at the bottom of a box. The letter from the hospital board is in there too. Not because I expect to need them again, but because there is something that matters about giving the true record a proper place to live. I still drive the CRV with the cracked windshield. I've kept meaning to fix it. But every morning when I get in and back out of the driveway and see that crack catching the light, I think about how long I let other things go without fixing them, and how much simpler everything got once I stopped. I don't need anyone to tell me who I am. I never did. But I've learned that saying so, clearly out loud when it needs to be said, that isn't arrogance. That's just the truth doing what it was always meant to do.